24-year-old Lara Novak stood in the security line at Prague International Airport, wearing a worn military surplus jacket with faded patches that made the guards snicker behind their hands. What they didn't know was that hidden in her wallet lay an insignia that would make seasoned intelligence officers salute on sight, and in the next few minutes, their world was about to be turned completely upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lara Novak pulled her small, black duffel bag from the overhead compartment of Flight LH1394 from Berlin to Prague, her movements carrying the precise efficiency that most people mistook for nervous energy. At 24, she looked like any other young European traveler returning home after a backpacking adventure. Her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and her olive green, military surplus jacket showing the kind of wear that suggested she'd bought it from a thrift store rather than earned it through service. The jacket's patches were faded and weathered, a generic eagle emblem that could be purchased at any army surplus shop, a small Czech flag sewn slightly crooked above the left pocket, and what appeared to be random military-style insignia that most observers would assume were decorative rather than authentic. The overall effect was of someone trying too hard to look military without actually having served, the kind of aesthetic choice that genuine veterans often found mildly annoying and security personnel typically viewed with suspicion. As Lara made her way through the jet bridge and into Václav Havel Airport, Prague, she moved with the unremarkable efficiency of someone who had traveled this route many times before. Her documentation was in order, her luggage contained nothing that would trigger additional scrutiny, and her appearance suggested nothing more threatening than a young woman who had perhaps spent too much money at military surplus stores during her university years. But beneath the carefully cultivated image of an ordinary traveler, Lara carried the invisible weight of 18 months that had transformed her from a linguistics graduate student into someone whose existence was known to fewer than 30 people in the European intelligence community. The faded patches on her jacket weren't purchased decorations. They were deliberately worn covers concealing markings that would have caused immediate escalation protocols at any security checkpoint in NATO countries. Her small duffel bag contained personal items that would pass any standard inspection, clothing appropriate for Prague's autumn weather, basic toiletries, a laptop computer loaded with academic papers on Slavic languages, and textbooks that supported her cover identity as a graduate student returning from a semester abroad. Hidden within the laptop's modified battery compartment was a micro SD card containing intelligence data that 3 different terrorist organizations would kill to obtain, and that 5 governments had spent considerable resources trying to acquire. Transformation from Lara Novak, graduate student in comparative linguistics, to operative nightingale of Joint Intelligence Task Force ECHO, had taken place in a converted warehouse outside Berlin over the course of 6 intensive months. Her natural talent for languages, she spoke 7 fluently and could manage basic communication in 12 others, had caught the attention of recruiters who specialized in identifying individuals with specific cognitive capabilities and psychological profiles suited for deep cover operations. What made Lara particularly valuable wasn't just her linguistic abilities, but her capacity to become genuinely invisible in plain sight. At 24, with her unremarkable height, common features, and ability to adopt the mannerisms and speech patterns of different European subcultures, she could disappear into crowds in ways that traditional intelligence operatives often struggled to achieve. Her youth worked in her favor. Security personnel, law enforcement officers, and even experienced intelligence agents often underestimated individuals who looked like university students, traveling on budget airlines. The specific mission that was concluding with her return to Prague had involved 18 months of deep cover infiltration of a human trafficking network that operated across 7 European countries. Lara had posed as a vulnerable university dropout seeking work abroad, allowing herself to be recruited into what appeared to be a legitimate employment agency but was actually a front for organizations that specialized in exploiting young Eastern European women. The intelligence she had gathered during those 18 months had already resulted in the arrest of 43 individuals, the rescue of over 200 victims, and the disruption of financial networks that had been funneling millions of euros to terrorist organizations operating in the Middle East and North Africa. 3 governments had commendation ceremonies planned for her, but Lara would never attend any of them. Her continued effectiveness depended on her ability to remain completely anonymous, someone whose achievements would never be publicly acknowledged or officially recognized. As she approached the customs and immigration area of Prague Airport, Lara felt the familiar weight of transition from operational environment back to civilian cover. In 12 hours, she would resume her official identity as a graduate student, return to her small apartment near Charles University, and begin preparing for examinations that would maintain her academic credentials. The person who had spent 18 months infiltrating criminal organizations would disappear completely, leaving behind only Lara Novak, a slightly overwhelmed young woman trying to balance her studies with part-time work at a language translation service. But first, she had to navigate the final checkpoint of her journey home, where her carefully constructed cover would face its most routine yet potentially dangerous test. The immigration queue at Prague Airport moved with the typical efficiency of European border control, and Lara found herself behind a family of German tourists arguing quietly about their connecting flight and a businessman who kept checking his phone with obvious irritation. When her turn came, she approached the booth with the same slightly nervous energy that most young travelers displayed when returning from abroad, her passport held ready in the way that suggested someone who traveled occasionally but wasn't quite comfortable with the process. The immigration officer, a middle-aged man named Karol Dvorak, who had been processing travelers for 12 years, barely glanced at her Czech passport before stamping it with the mechanical efficiency that characterized the end of a long shift. Purpose of travel? He asked in English, despite her Czech documents, apparently assuming she was more comfortable in the international language. Studies, Lara replied in Czech, her accent carrying the slight regional variation of someone from the Moravian countryside rather than Prague itself. I was doing research in Berlin for my thesis on dialectical variations in Slavic languages. The explanation was detailed enough to sound genuine, but boring enough to discourage follow-up questions, exactly the kind of response that had been drilled into her during cover identity training. Dvorak nodded without interest and gestured for her to proceed to baggage claim, but Lara's real test was waiting 30 meters ahead at the customs checkpoint, where 3 security officers were conducting random additional screenings of passengers who fit certain demographic profiles or whose travel patterns triggered automated review systems. Officer Milan Hora had been working airport security for 8 years, and he had developed what he considered to be a keen eye for travelers who didn't quite fit their apparent circumstances. Young people carrying expensive electronics they couldn't afford, business travelers whose luggage suggested leisure activities, and especially individuals whose clothing or accessories seemed inconsistent with their stated purposes for travel. When he spotted Lara approaching with her worn military surplus jacket and student identification, something immediately triggered his professional suspicions. "Excuse me, miss," Hora called out in Czech, using the tone of polite authority that security personnel employed when they wanted to demonstrate their importance to colleagues and passengers alike. "I'd like to conduct a brief additional screening of your luggage and documentation." Lara stopped immediately, her expression shifting to the mild confusion and concern that most innocent travelers displayed when selected for additional security measures. "Is there a problem with my documents?" she asked, allowing a slight tremor of nervousness to enter her voice while internally calculating the probability that this was routine screening versus targeted surveillance. Hora's partner, Officer Janis Svoboda, joined the interaction with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The casual interest of someone who had conducted thousands of similar screenings, but still found certain passengers amusing. She immediately noticed Lara's military surplus jacket and the collection of patches that suggested someone trying to project an image of toughness or military connection without any genuine understanding of what the various insignia actually represented. "Just a routine check," Svoboda said, her voice carrying a barely concealed note of amusement as she gestured toward Lara's jacket. "That's quite a collection of patches you have there. Are you interested in military history?" The question was clearly designed to elicit information about Lara's background while simultaneously establishing the officer's skepticism about her apparent military aesthetic. Lara recognized the technique immediately. It was a standard approach, used by security personnel to gauge whether someone's appearance matched their actual background and to identify individuals who might be attempting to impersonate military personnel or claim service they had never performed. "I bought the jacket at a second-hand store in Berlin," Lara replied with the slight embarrassment of someone who suddenly realized their fashion choice might be problematic. "I thought it looked interesting, but I don't really know what the patches mean. I just like the style." Hora nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose initial assessment had been confirmed. In his experience, genuine military personnel either wore their uniforms with proper regulations or avoided military-style clothing entirely when traveling as civilians. Young people who combined military surplus clothing with student identification were usually engaging in some form of aesthetic posturing that reflected their civilian background rather than actual service experience. "Please place your bag on the inspection table," Svoboda instructed, her professional demeanor now tinged with the slightly condescending tone that security officers often adopted when dealing with individuals they had categorized as harmless but attention-seeking. "We'll need to examine the contents and verify that everything is consistent with your stated purpose for travel." As Lara complied with the request, placing her duffel bag on the stainless steel examination table, she noticed that several other passengers in the customs area had paused to observe the additional screening. Some appeared curious about potential security threats, while others seemed simply entertained by the prospect of watching someone experience the mild humiliation that additional scrutiny often entailed. The third member of the security team, Officer Petr Novotny, approached the table with the confident stride of someone who enjoyed the authority that his position provided. He had been listening to the exchange between his colleagues and the young woman, and had formed his own preliminary assessment based on her appearance and responses to their questions. "University student with a military fashion phase," Novotny murmured to Hora, just loudly enough for Lara to overhear. "Probably bought the whole outfit thinking it would make her look more interesting to her classmates." The comment drew quiet laughter from his colleagues and knowing smiles from several nearby passengers who had overheard the observation. Lara maintained her expression of mild discomfort while internally noting the professional dynamics at play and the specific personality she was dealing with. These were experienced security officers who took pride in their ability to read people quickly and accurately, but they were also individuals whose confidence in their assessment skills sometimes led them to make assumptions that weren't supported by complete information. As the officers began examining the contents of her bag with the thorough attention that suggested they expected to find something inconsistent with her student cover story, Lara prepared herself for the next phase of an interaction that was about to become significantly more complicated than anyone in the customs area could possibly anticipate. Officer Hora methodically removed items from Lara's duffel bag, arranging them on the inspection table with the theatrical precision that security personnel often employed when they wanted to demonstrate their thoroughness to observing passengers. Each item was examined briefly before being placed in neat rows, budget travel clothing that showed the wear patterns of extended use, basic toiletries in travel-sized containers, a worn paperback novel in German, and textbooks on Slavic linguistics. That supported her academic cover story. Student budget travel. Svoboda commented with obvious amusement as she picked up a sweater that had clearly been purchased from a discount retailer, but expensive enough taste in military fashion accessories to buy authentic-looking surplus gear. She gestured toward Lara's jacket with the kind of dismissive smile that suggested she had encountered this particular combination of student poverty and aesthetic pretension many times before. The laptop computer drew more serious attention, as electronic devices always did during security screenings, but after a brief examination of its contents and confirmation that it contained academic papers and research materials consistent with Lara's stated field of study, it was categorized as unremarkable. Novotny scrolled through several documents with the bored efficiency of someone who had examined thousands of similar devices and found them uniformly uninteresting. Comparative linguistics, he read from one of the file names, his tone suggesting that he found academic pursuits generally incomprehensible and slightly ridiculous. Must be fascinating to spend 3 years studying why people in different countries pronounce words differently. The comment drew chuckles from his colleagues and eye rolls from nearby passengers, who recognized the anti-intellectual sentiment that some security personnel displayed toward university students. But it was Lara's wallet that became the primary source of entertainment for the security team. The leather wallet was worn, but well made, suggesting it had been a gift from someone with better financial resources than a graduate student typically possessed, and it contained the usual collection of items that young travelers carried: student identification, credit cards with low limits, membership cards for university libraries, and photographs that supported her cover identity. Czech university student ID, German library card, train passes for half a dozen countries. Hora enumerated with growing amusement as he examined each item. And here we have the collection of military surplus patches sewn onto what's probably a €50 jacket from an army surplus store in Berlin. He held up the jacket for his colleagues to examine more closely, pointing to specific patches that he recognized as generic military-style decorations available at any surplus retailer. Svoboda joined the commentary with obvious enjoyment, having identified what she considered to be a perfect example of the kind of civilian military posturing that security professionals encountered regularly. Look at this combination: eagle wings that don't match any actual military organization, a Czech flag that's sewn crooked like someone did it by hand, and what appears to be a ranger tab that you can buy online for €15. The three officers began discussing Lara as if she weren't standing directly in front of them, their conversation taking on the tone of experienced professionals sharing observations about a particularly amusing example of civilian behavior. Other passengers in the customs area had begun paying attention to the exchange, some appearing sympathetic to what they assumed was an embarrassing situation for a young woman whose fashion choices were being publicly criticized. University students love this aesthetic, Novotny explained to a nearby passenger who had asked about the commotion. They buy military surplus clothing thinking it makes them look tough or interesting, but they don't understand that actual military personnel can spot fake insignia immediately. It's like wearing a football jersey and expecting people to think you play professional sports. Lara maintained her expression of mild embarrassment while internally cataloging the specific assumptions and personality traits that each officer was displaying. Hora appeared to be the detail-oriented leader who took pride in his analytical abilities. Svoboda seemed to enjoy the social aspect of demonstrating her expertise to colleagues and observers, and Novotny was clearly someone who used his security position to feel superior to people he perceived as pretentious or naive. The whole military tourist look has become really popular with young Europeans, Svoboda continued, warming to her theme as she noticed more passengers paying attention to her commentary. They think wearing surplus gear makes them look worldly and experienced, but it usually just indicates that they've never actually served in any military organization and don't understand what the insignia represents. The criticism extended beyond Lara's clothing to her overall presentation and implied background. Hora speculated that she was probably from a comfortable middle-class family that had funded her university education and European travel, allowing her to play at being tough or military-connected without ever facing actual hardship or danger. Svoboda agreed, suggesting that genuine military experience would have taught her to avoid wearing insignia she hadn't earned. Real veterans either wear their actual uniforms for official purposes or dress completely civilian, Novotny added with the authority of someone who considered himself an expert on military culture despite having never served in any capacity. Beyond airport security, they don't mix and match random patches like they're collecting Pokemon cards. As the officers continued their examination and commentary, none of them noticed the subtle shift in Lara's posture or the way her eyes had begun tracking the positions and movement patterns of everyone in the immediate area. Her operational training was automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes, while her conscious mind maintained the appearance of mild discomfort appropriate to someone whose fashion choices were being publicly mocked by authority figures. The wallet examination was nearing completion, with Hora preparing to return her belongings and conclude what had become an entertaining diversion for the security team. But he had saved the inner compartments of the wallet for last, following standard protocol for thorough document searches, and was about to discover that his confident assessment of Lara's background and authenticity was about to be challenged in ways that none of them could have anticipated. What Officer Hora was about to discover in the concealed compartment of Lara's wallet would have immediate security implications that extended far beyond airport customs procedures. Hidden behind what appeared to be a simple photo sleeve was an identification document that existed in the databases of fewer than 6 law enforcement organizations worldwide, each of which maintained classified protocols for handling individuals who carried such credentials. The document itself was unremarkable. In appearance, a small laminated card, approximately the size of a credit card, bearing only a photograph, an alphanumeric identification code, and a holographic security feature that was invisible under normal lighting conditions but became clearly visible under the specific wavelength LED illumination that customs officers used for document verification. To casual observation, it would appear to be another form of student identification, or perhaps a library card from an obscure institution. But the alphanumeric code on the card, NW7749ECHO, corresponded to an individual whose existence was known to the Joint Intelligence Coordination Center in Brussels, the Czech Military Intelligence Service, and 3 other European security organizations that maintained cooperative relationships for counter-terrorism operations. The holographic security feature, when properly illuminated, would display an insignia that represented operational clearance for deep cover missions in hostile environments, the kind of authorization that required approval from multiple government agencies and extensive psychological evaluation. Lara's operational success over the previous 18 months had been built on her ability to become completely invisible within the criminal organizations she was tasked to infiltrate. Her natural talent for languages, combined with her capacity to adopt the mannerisms and psychological patterns of different demographic groups, had allowed her to maintain cover identities that withstood scrutiny from individuals whose survival depended on their ability to identify potential threats or infiltrators. The human trafficking network she had penetrated operated with sophisticated counterintelligence measures, including background verification procedures that had exposed several previous attempts at infiltration by traditional law enforcement agencies. Lara's success had come from her ability to present herself as genuinely vulnerable and desperate, someone whose circumstances made her an ideal victim rather than a potential threat to their operations. Her linguistic abilities had been crucial, to the mission's success. The trafficking network operated across multiple countries and required communication in 7 different languages, including regional dialects that most intelligence operatives would have struggled to master convincingly. Lara's academic background in comparative linguistics provided perfect cover for her ability to switch between languages and adopt authentic regional accents that helped establish her credibility with different elements of the criminal organization. The intelligence she had gathered during her 18 months undercover had revealed connections between the trafficking network and terrorist financing operations that intelligence agencies had been trying to map for over 3 years. Her access to financial records, communication protocols, and operational plans had provided law enforcement agencies with the information needed to disrupt not only the trafficking operations, but also several planned terrorist attacks that had been funded through those criminal enterprises. The rescue of over 200 victims had been coordinated based on intelligence that Lara had provided about the locations where trafficked individuals were being held, the security measures that protected those facilities, and the timing of transportation operations that moved victims between different countries. Each rescue operation had required careful coordination to avoid alerting other elements of the network that their security had been compromised. The arrest of 43 individuals had been timed to occur simultaneously across 7 countries, preventing the network from warning its members or destroying evidence once the first arrests became known. Lara's intelligence had provided law enforcement agencies with the detailed operational structure they needed to identify key personnel, financial assets, and communication systems that could be targeted in coordinated raids. But perhaps most significantly, the financial intelligence that Lara had gathered had revealed how trafficking profits were being laundered through legitimate businesses and then transferred to terrorist organizations operating in Syria, Iraq, and North Africa. This information had allowed intelligence agencies to freeze millions of euros in assets and disrupt funding for operations that could have resulted in hundreds of civilian casualties. The psychological toll of maintaining deep cover for 18 months in such an environment had been substantial. Lara had been required to witness criminal activities that she could not immediately prevent without compromising her mission. To develop personal relationships with individuals she knew she would eventually help prosecute, and to maintain her cover identity, even when doing so meant allowing certain illegal activities to continue until law enforcement agencies could coordinate comprehensive responses. Her handlers had provided psychological support throughout the mission, but the nature of deep cover operations meant that contact with her support network had been extremely limited and carefully scheduled to avoid detection. For most of the 18 months, Lara had been essentially alone, maintaining her operational effectiveness through mental discipline techniques that were taught only to individuals whose psychological profiles indicated they could handle extended isolation while maintaining mission focus. The transition back to civilian cover had its own challenges. After 18 months of constant vigilance and role-playing, returning to the relatively simple identity of a university student required significant psychological adjustment. The skills that had kept her alive in hostile environments, constant situational awareness, threat assessment, and deception detection, were not easily turned off, even when she was no longer in operational circumstances. As Officer Hora prepared to examine the final compartment of her wallet, Lara calculated the probability that her true credentials would be discovered and weighed the potential consequences of different response strategies. Her training covered protocols for maintaining cover when faced with routine security checks, but the specific circumstances of this interaction fell into a gray area where standard procedures might not apply. The security officer's treatment of Lara reflected a pattern of assumptions that had characterized their interactions with young travelers throughout their careers at Prague Airport. Over the years, they had developed what they considered to be reliable methods for categorizing passengers based on appearance, documentation, and behavior patterns, and their confidence in these assessment techniques had been reinforced by thousands of routine encounters with individuals whose circumstances matched their initial impressions. Hora had been conducting security screenings for 8 years, during which time he had encountered hundreds of university students whose travel patterns, clothing choices, and personal belongings suggested specific socio-economic backgrounds and lifestyle preferences. His experience had taught him to identify particular combinations of factors that indicated civilian attempts to adopt military aesthetics without genuine service backgrounds, and he took professional pride in his ability to distinguish between authentic military personnel and individuals who were simply attracted to military-style fashion. "You see this type regularly," Hora explained to a trainee officer who had joined the customs area to observe screening procedures. "University students who spend their semester abroad money on military surplus clothing, thinking it makes them look more interesting to their friends back home. They never understand that actual veterans can spot the inconsistencies immediately." Svoboda had developed similar assessment patterns during her 6 years in airport security, particularly regarding young women who traveled independently through Europe and adopted what she termed adventure tourist aesthetics. Her experience had shown her that individuals who combined student identification with military-style clothing were usually engaging in a form of identity experimentation that reflected their civilian backgrounds rather than any genuine military experience or connection. "The patches are always the giveaway." Svoboda continued her commentary for the benefit of nearby passengers who seemed interested in the security officer's expertise. "Real military personnel either wear proper uniforms with regulation insignia, or they dress completely civilian. They don't mix random surplus store patches like they're collecting souvenirs from different countries." Novotny's assessment was based on broader assumptions about generational attitudes toward military service and authority that he had developed through his interactions with young travelers. In his view, most university students from comfortable backgrounds viewed military service as either an unfortunate necessity for people without better opportunities, or as an aesthetic choice that could be adopted temporarily without understanding the genuine commitments and sacrifices that military service required. "This generation thinks they can try on different identities like clothing," Novotny observed, his tone carrying the dismissive certainty of someone who believed his age and experience provided him with superior understanding of social dynamics. "Military service becomes just another fashion statement, like wearing band t-shirts from music groups they've never actually listened to." The pattern of dismissal extended beyond Lara's appearance to their assumptions about her background, education, and life experiences. The security officers had unconsciously constructed a complete narrative about her circumstances based on limited information, filling in details that supported their initial assessment while ignoring or minimizing evidence that might contradict their conclusions. Hora assumed that her ability to afford European travel indicated family financial support that had protected her from genuine hardship or challenging circumstances. Her university identification suggested to him a lifestyle of academic pursuits that were disconnected from practical realities or serious responsibilities. The quality of her luggage and personal belongings indicated to him someone who had never faced genuine scarcity or dangerous situations. Svoboda's assessment focused on what she perceived as attention-seeking behavior disguised as practicality. The military surplus jacket was interpreted as an attempt to project toughness or worldliness that compensated for actual inexperience with challenging circumstances. The collection of patches was seen as evidence of someone who wanted to appear well-traveled and experienced without having earned those credentials through genuine service or sacrifice. University students always want to look like they've been through more than they actually have, Svoboda explained to her colleagues. They buy surplus clothing and collect patches thinking it gives them credibility, but it usually just indicates that they've never been in situations where those things actually matter. The dismissive pattern was reinforced by their interactions with other passengers in the customs area. several of whom had begun following the security officer's commentary with obvious entertainment. The public nature of their assessment created a social dynamic where the officers felt pressured to demonstrate their expertise and authority, leading them to become more confident in their characterizations of Lara's background and circumstances. Other travelers contributed to the dismissive atmosphere by sharing their own observations about young people who adopted military aesthetics without military backgrounds. An older businessman waiting for his luggage to be inspected mentioned seeing similar combinations of student identification and surplus military clothing in airports throughout Europe, suggesting it had become a recognizable travel fashion among university students. It's like wearing a football jersey and expecting people to think you play professional sports. Another passenger agreed, echoing Novotny's earlier comparison. The real athletes are usually wearing regular clothes and carrying equipment bags that show actual use. A middle-aged woman who identified herself as the mother of a son currently serving in the Czech military expressed particular irritation with young people who wore military-style clothing without having earned the right to do so. "My son is deployed right now defending our country. And then you see kids like this, playing dress-up with military symbols they don't understand. It's disrespectful to people who actually serve." The accumulating commentary had created an atmosphere where Lara's credibility and authenticity were being systematically undermined by multiple voices, each contributing assumptions and judgments that reinforced the security officer's initial assessment. The public nature of the discussion had transformed a routine security screening into a broader social evaluation of her character, background, and right to wear the clothing and carry the accessories she had chosen. As the officers prepared to complete their examination of her belongings, their confidence in their assessment had been strengthened by the social validation they had received from other passengers and the consistent patterns they believed they had observed in Lara's appearance and documentation. None of them suspected that their systematic dismissal of her authenticity was about to be challenged by evidence that would force them to completely reconsider everything they thought they understood about the young woman standing in front of them. Throughout the escalating commentary and public dismissal of her appearance and presumed background, Lara maintained the composed bearing that had been essential to her survival during 18 months of deep cover operations. Her facial expression remained fixed in the mild discomfort and embarrassment that any ordinary university student would naturally display when being publicly criticized by authority figures, but her internal responses were guided by operational training that had taught her to process social aggression as tactical information rather than personal attack. The discipline required to maintain her cover identity while listening to detailed criticisms of her authenticity was considerable. Every instinct developed through months of high-stakes operational work urged her to correct the false assumptions, to provide evidence of her actual background, or to demonstrate the professional competence that would immediately shift the dynamic of the interaction. Instead, she drew upon psychological techniques that allowed her to mentally separate her operational identity from her cover persona, treating the security officer's comments as confirmation that her disguise was functioning exactly as intended. Her training had included extensive preparation for situations where maintaining cover required accepting public humiliation, professional dismissal, or personal attacks that challenged her sense of identity and self-worth. Intelligence operatives working in deep cover frequently faced circumstances where their actual achievements and capabilities had to remain hidden, while they endured treatment that was inconsistent with their genuine status and accomplishments. "I understand that my jacket might look unusual," Lara responded when Svoboda made a particularly pointed comment about civilian military posturing. Her voice carried exactly the right combination of apologetic defensiveness and uncertain embarrassment that characterized someone who was beginning to question their own fashion choices under professional scrutiny. "I really did just buy it because I thought it looked practical for traveling." The response was carefully calibrated to reinforce the officer's existing assumptions while avoiding any details that might trigger additional questions or suspicions. Her tone suggested someone who was intimidated by authority figures and uncertain about how to respond to professional criticism, exactly the kind of vulnerability that would confirm their assessment of her as an inexperienced civilian trying to project an image she couldn't actually support. When Novotny made his comment comparing military surplus fashion to wearing sports jerseys without playing professional sports, Lara nodded with apparent understanding, as if his analogy had helped her recognize the inappropriateness of her clothing choices. "I never thought about it that way," she said, her voice carrying the slightly ashamed tone of someone who had been educated about social norms they had unknowingly violated. Her body language throughout the interaction remained consistent with someone who was experiencing mild stress and embarrassment, but was not attempting to challenge or escalate the situation. She kept her hands visible and relaxed, maintained appropriate eye contact without appearing confrontational, and positioned herself in ways that suggested compliance with the officer's authority while avoiding any movements that might be interpreted as threatening or suspicious. The psychological effort required to maintain this performance was substantial. Lara's operational training had conditioned her to assess threats, identify escape routes, and prepare defensive responses automatically, but expressing any of these capabilities would have immediately compromised her cover and potentially created serious complications for ongoing intelligence operations that depended on her continued anonymity. Instead, she channeled her situational awareness into maintaining perfect consistency with her cover identity. When other passengers joined the commentary about young people who inappropriately wore military clothing, she appeared to listen with the chastened attention of someone who was learning about social expectations they had previously misunderstood. "Thank you for explaining that," she said to the woman whose son was deployed with the Czech military, her tone carrying genuine-sounding appreciation for what appeared to be valuable education about military culture and appropriate civilian behavior. "I really didn't mean any disrespect. I just liked the way the jacket looked and thought it would be practical for traveling." The apology reinforced her image as someone who was well-intentioned but naive, someone whose apparent military aesthetic reflected poor judgment rather than any attempt to claim unearned credentials or status. Her willingness to accept correction and express gratitude for guidance suggested the kind of teachable humility that authority figures often found satisfying, and that typically de-escalated potentially confrontational situations. Throughout the perkly de-escalated potentially confrontational situations. Extended examination and commentary. Lara also demonstrated the kind of helpful compliance that characterized genuinely cooperative travelers. When asked to remove items from her pockets for additional inspection, she did so promptly and completely. When requested to explain the contents of her luggage, she provided detailed responses that were consistent with her student cover story, and offered additional information that seemed designed to be helpful rather than defensive. Her behavior during the screening process reflected someone who understood that security procedures were necessary and important, even when they were inconvenient or embarrassing. She expressed appropriate patience when the officers took extra time to examine her belongings, and she answered follow-up questions with the kind of detail that suggested someone who had nothing to hide and wanted to be as cooperative as possible. Contrast between her actual capabilities and the image she was projecting was extraordinary. A person who had successfully infiltrated international criminal organizations, gathered intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks, and coordinated operations that had saved hundreds of lives was presenting herself as an apologetic university student whose greatest transgression was poor fashion, judgment, and cultural insensitivity. As Officer Hora prepared to examine the final compartment of her wallet, Lara maintained her expression of patient cooperation while internally calculating the probability that her true credentials would be discovered and the potential consequences of different Response strategies that might be required depending on what the next few minutes revealed. The customs area at Prague Airport had become an impromptu theater where Lara's perceived authenticity was being systematically dismantled by an audience that had grown to include nearly 20 passengers and 4 additional airport personnel who had been drawn to the commotion. What had begun as a routine security screening had evolved into a public demonstration of the security officer's expertise in identifying civilian military posturing, with Lara serving as the unwilling centerpiece of their professional validation. Officer Svoboda had begun using Lara's case as an educational opportunity for a group of trainee security personnel who had arrived to observe screening procedures. "This is exactly the kind of situation you'll encounter regularly," she explained, gesturing toward Lara's jacket with obvious satisfaction. "University students who adopt military aesthetics without understanding what the insignia represents, or why wearing unearned decorations is problematic." The trainee officers gathered around the inspection table, their notebooks ready to record observations about identifying suspicious or inappropriate behavior among travelers. Svoboda pointed to specific patches on Lara's jacket, explaining why each one indicated civilian origin rather than legitimate military service. "Notice how the patches are sewn on crooked, how they don't match any actual military organization, and how they're combined in ways that no real veteran would ever arrange." Novotny had begun taking photographs of Lara's jacket and accessories, explaining that the images would be useful for training materials about civilian military impersonation. "We'll use this as an example for new officers about what to look for when assessing travelers who might be attempting to claim military status they haven't earned," he announced, his camera flash drawing additional attention from passengers. Throughout the customs area, the photography session had attracted the interest of other airport personnel, including supervisors who had come to investigate why a routine screening was requiring so much time and generating so much attention. Rather than ending the interaction, their arrival had provided the security officers with additional opportunities to demonstrate their expertise and justify the extended examination of Lara's belongings. "This individual represents a perfect example of the civilian military tourist phenomenon," Hora explained to his supervisor, using language that suggested he was presenting evidence for an official report. "Student identification, budget travel accessories, and military surplus clothing that's clearly purchased rather than earned. The combination of factors indicates someone who wants to project military experience without actually having served." The supervisor, a senior officer named Captain Marek Svoboda, who had 20 years of airport security experience, examined Lara's jacket and personal belongings with the attention of someone who was evaluating both the passenger and his officers' assessment techniques. His presence had elevated the interaction from routine screening to potential case study, increasing the pressure on everyone involved to demonstrate professional competence. "The patches are obviously purchased decorations," Captain Svoboda agreed, his confirmation providing official validation for his officer's assessment. "Real military personnel either wear regulation uniforms or dress completely civilian. They don't combine random insignia like they're collecting souvenirs from different military organizations." The crowd of observers had begun offering their own commentary about young people who inappropriately adopted military symbols, creating a chorus of disapproval that reinforced the officer's characterization of Lara as someone who was disrespecting military service through ignorance or attention-seeking behavior. Several passengers shared stories about their own military service or family members who had served, using their experiences to validate the criticism of Lara's appearance. "My husband served 25 years in the Czech army," announced an older woman who had been waiting for her luggage inspection. "He would be disgusted to see someone wearing military patches they hadn't earned. It's an insult to people who actually sacrificed for their country." A businessman who had served in the reserves added his voice to the growing criticism. Military service isn't a fashion statement. Those patches represent honor, sacrifice, and commitment that you can't buy at a surplus store. Wearing them without earning them is basically lying about your service record. The accumulating public disapproval had created an atmosphere where Lara was being treated not just as someone with poor fashion judgment, but as someone whose behavior reflected deeper character flaws and social irresponsibility. The security officers were no longer simply conducting a routine inspection. They were providing moral education about respect for military service and appropriate civilian behavior. Hora had begun documenting the incident for what he described as a training report about identifying civilian military impersonation. We'll include this case in our quarterly briefing about passenger assessment techniques, he explained to the gathered trainees. The subject displays all the classic indicators of someone attempting to project military experience through purchased accessories rather than earned credentials. The documentation process included detailed descriptions of Lara's appearance, luggage contents, and responses to questioning, all recorded as evidence supporting their assessment of her as a civilian who was inappropriately wearing military symbols. The official nature of their documentation suggested that the incident would have lasting consequences beyond the immediate embarrassment of public criticism. As the examination approached its conclusion, with only the final compartment of Lara's wallet remaining to be inspected, the security officers' confidence in their assessment had been reinforced by official approval, peer validation, and public support. The extended duration of the screening had transformed it from routine procedure into demonstration of professional expertise, with Lara serving as evidence that their training and experience provided them with reliable methods for identifying travelers whose appearance didn't match their actual backgrounds. None of the officers, supervisors, trainees, or observing passengers suspected that the next few minutes would provide evidence that would completely invalidate every assumption they had made about the young woman whose authenticity they had so thoroughly and publicly dismissed. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover identity while enduring 20 minutes of systematic public humiliation had pushed Lara's operational discipline to its absolute limits. Every technique she had learned for compartmentalizing emotional responses and maintaining professional composure was being tested by an interaction that had evolved far beyond routine security screening into a deliberate demonstration of her supposed inadequacy and dishonesty. The moment that threatened to shatter her carefully maintained facade came when Captain Svoboda made a comment that struck directly at the core of her professional identity and personal integrity. "The real tragedy," he announced to the gathered crowd of officers and passengers, "is that behavior like this undermines public trust in genuine military personnel. When civilians wear unearned military symbols, it makes it harder for people to recognize and respect actual veterans." The irony of being lectured about respect for military service by someone who had never faced combat situations or risked his life for intelligence operations that saved civilian lives created a moment of internal crisis that Lara struggled to control. For 18 months, she had maintained cover identities that required her to accept treatment that was inconsistent with her actual achievements. But this particular criticism challenged her ability to remain silent about accomplishments that had directly protected the very people who were now questioning her authenticity. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the extended examination, began to tremble slightly as she fought the overwhelming urge to provide evidence that would immediately validate her credentials and silence the mounting criticism. The trembling was barely visible, but it represented a crack in the psychological armor that had protected her throughout months of dangerous undercover operations. "Are you feeling all right, miss?" Novotny asked, his tone carrying a mixture of concern and satisfaction as he noticed her apparent distress. "I understand that having your fashion choices questioned can be embarrassing, but it's important for you to understand why wearing military insignia you haven't earned is problematic." The condescending offer of sympathy combined with the assumption that her distress reflected embarrassment about fashion rather than the psychological strain of maintaining cover under extreme provocation, pushed Lara's self-control to its breaking point. For a moment that lasted less than 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity, her operational training warred with her personal integrity as she considered the satisfaction that would come from revealing exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. Her breathing patterns shifted slightly, becoming more controlled and measured as she activated psychological techniques that had been essential during the most dangerous phases of her undercover operations. The change was subtle but represented a conscious decision to retreat deeper into her cover identity, rather than risk exposure that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and endanger other operatives who were currently working in the field. "I'm fine," she responded, her voice carrying exactly the right combination of emotional strain and determined cooperation that would be expected from someone who was trying to maintain dignity while being publicly criticized by authority figures. "I just want to get through this process and continue on to my destination." But the stress was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The extended duration of the interaction, combined with the public nature of the humiliation and the increasing number of people who were treating her case as entertainment or educational opportunity, had created psychological pressure that exceeded what her cover identity could reasonably be expected to withstand. Svoboda noticed the change in her demeanor and interpreted it as confirmation that their assessment had been accurate. "Sometimes people don't realize how their choices affect others," she explained to the trainees who were documenting the interaction. "When confronted with the implications of wearing unearned military symbols, civilians often become defensive or emotional because they know their behavior is inappropriate." The psychological analysis, delivered as if Lara were not present to hear herself being discussed as an example of problematic civilian behavior, represented another layer of dehumanization that tested her ability to maintain operational composure. Being treated as a case study rather than a person, having her emotional responses analyzed and categorized by people who had no understanding of her actual circumstances, created a level of frustration that threatened to overwhelm her professional training. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she processed the irony of being lectured about military ethics by airport security personnel, while suppressing evidence of operations that had saved more lives than all of their combined careers would ever impact. The internal tension between her professional obligations and her personal dignity had reached a level that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The breaking point came when one of the trainee officers asked if he could take additional photographs of her patches for a presentation about civilian military impersonation that he was preparing for his certification examination. The request to use her image as an example of inappropriate behavior for educational purposes represented a level of institutional humiliation that pushed beyond what her cover identity could reasonably be expected to endure. "Please," Lara said, her voice carrying the first note of genuine strain that had been audible throughout the entire interaction. "I just want to collect my belongings and continue to my destination. I understand that my jacket was inappropriate, and I won't wear it again." The plea represented the closest she had come to breaking character, and it drew sympathetic responses from several passengers who felt that the security officer's educational demonstration had become unnecessarily prolonged and humiliating. But it also provided Officer Hora with the opening he needed to conclude the examination by checking the final compartment of her wallet, a routine procedure that was about to reveal evidence that would transform the entire dynamic of the interaction in ways that none of them could possibly anticipate. As his fingers moved toward the concealed pocket that contained her operational credentials, Lara realized that the next 30 seconds would either vindicate her beyond any doubt or create complications that could extend far beyond personal embarrassment into matters of national security and international intelligence cooperation. Officer Hora's fingers had just touched the edge of the concealed compartment in Lara's wallet when the sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the customs area, accompanied by the distinctive cadence of multiple individuals, moving with military precision across the polished airport floor. The approaching footsteps carried the unmistakable rhythm of coordinated movement that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the vicinity, including the security officers who had been so thoroughly absorbed in their examination and commentary. First figure to appear in the customs area was a tall man in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his bearing and movement patterns immediately recognizable to anyone with experience in military or intelligence organizations. His appearance commanded attention, not through ostentation, but through the kind of quiet authority that characterized senior personnel, who were accustomed to operating in high-stakes environments where competence and credibility were matters of life and death. Behind him followed two additional figures, a woman and a man, both carrying themselves with the same professional bearing and wearing clothing that suggested official business of considerable importance. Their coordinated arrival and purposeful movement toward the customs inspection area created an immediate shift in the atmosphere, transforming what had been a routine passenger screening into something that clearly involved matters beyond typical airport security procedures. The lead figure approached Officer Hora with the kind of focused attention that suggested he had specific business to conduct and limited time in which to accomplish his objectives. His identification was already in his hand as he spoke, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who was accustomed to being taken seriously by law enforcement and security personnel. Agent Director Lara Novak, Czech Intelligence Service, he announced, presenting credentials that immediately captured the complete attention of every security officer in the area. I need to speak with you regarding the individual you are currently screening. The presentation of intelligence service credentials created an immediate transformation in the behavior of everyone present. Captain Svoboda stepped forward with obvious concern, his demeanor shifting from casual authority to professional deference as he recognized that the situation had escalated far beyond routine airport security procedures into matters that fell under the jurisdiction of national intelligence organizations. Sir, we were conducting a standard screening of a university student whose appearance suggested potential civilian military impersonation, Captain Svoboda explained, his voice reflecting uncertainty about whether the security officers had inadvertently become involved in matters of national security significance. We found inconsistencies in her presentation that warranted additional examination. Agent Director Novak's expression remained professionally neutral as he listened to the explanation, but his eyes moved to Lara with the kind of recognition that suggested familiarity with her circumstances and background. The eye contact lasted only a moment, but it was sufficient to communicate information that transcended verbal explanation and confirmed that this unexpected intervention was directly related to her actual identity rather than her cover persona. The individual you are screening is currently under the protection of Czech Intelligence Service protocols, Agent Director Novak explained, his tone carrying the weight of official authority, while remaining sufficiently vague to avoid revealing sensitive operational details. Her current circumstances require specific handling procedures that supersede standard airport security protocols. The second agent, who had been observing the crowd of passengers and airport personnel that had gathered around the inspection area, stepped forward to address the practical implications of the situation. We need to complete this interaction with appropriate discretion to avoid compromising ongoing security matters, she said, her voice carrying the kind of professional urgency that suggested time-sensitive considerations were involved. The presence of 3 intelligence officers in the customs area had created a level of tension and curiosity that extended far beyond the immediate participants in Lara's screening. Other passengers throughout the customs area had begun to notice the official presence and the serious nature of the conversation taking place around the inspection table. leading to speculation about potential security threats or law enforcement operations that might be unfolding. Airport security personnel, who had not been directly involved in Lara's screening, began arriving in the area, drawn by radio communications that had alerted them to the presence of intelligence service agents in their facility. Their arrival added to the growing sense that routine airport operations had been interrupted by matters of considerable official importance. The trainee officers who had been documenting Lara's case as an example of civilian military impersonation found themselves witnessing an interaction that was clearly beyond their level of clearance or understanding. Their notebooks remained open, but they had stopped taking notes as it became apparent that the situation they were observing involved classified matters that could not be included in training materials or official reports. Officer Hora still held Lara's wallet, his fingers frozen at the edge of the concealed compartment as he processed the implications of intelligence service intervention in what he had confidently assessed as a routine case of civilian military posturing. The wallet had become evidence in a situation that was clearly more complex than anyone in airport security had understood or anticipated. The crowd of passengers who had been entertained by the security officer's critique of Lara's appearance and presumed background now found themselves witnessing what appeared to be a classified intelligence operation unfolding in a public airport facility. Their expressions had shifted from amusement to concern as they began to understand that they had been observing someone whose actual circumstances were far different from what they had been led to believe. Agent Director Novak's next words would determine whether the situation could be resolved with appropriate discretion, or whether the public nature of the interaction would require more extensive damage control measures to protect ongoing intelligence operations and maintain the security protocols that surrounded Lara's true identity and recent operational activities. The three intelligence officers arranged themselves in a formation that immediately communicated their professional hierarchy and the serious nature of their business in the customs area. Agent Director Novak remained in the lead position, his bearing and positioning indicating ultimate authority over the developing situation, while his two colleagues flanked him in a configuration that suggested both support and security awareness. Their coordinated positioning was not accidental. Each agent had automatically assumed a location that provided optimal visibility of the customs area, potential escape routes, and the growing crowd of observers who had been drawn to the unusual spectacle of intelligence service personnel conducting official business in a public airport facility. Their training was evident in the way they maintained situational awareness while focusing on the immediate task of resolving Lara's circumstances. Agent Director Novak's credentials remained visible as he addressed the assembled security officers, his identification serving as a constant reminder that the authority hierarchy in the customs area had shifted dramatically with their arrival. The Czech intelligence service seal on his identification carried weight that superseded airport security protocols and created immediate deference from personnel who were accustomed to representing the highest level of authority in their facility. Officer Hora, I need you to return the individual's belongings and documentation immediately, Agent Director Novak instructed, his tone carrying the kind of quiet command authority that indicated non-negotiable requirements. The screening you have been conducting must be terminated at this time due to security considerations that are beyond the scope of airport customs procedures. The second agent, who had introduced herself as Senior Analyst Marie Svoboda, stepped forward to address the practical implications of concluding the screening process while maintaining appropriate operational security. Her presence provided additional official weight to their intervention, while suggesting that multiple levels of intelligence service hierarchy were involved in resolving Lara's situation. The documentation and personal effects that have been examined must be returned without further inspection, Senior Analyst Svoboda explained to Officer Hora, her voice carrying professional urgency that emphasized the time-sensitive nature of their requirements. Any photographs or notes that have been taken during this screening process must be turned over to check intelligence service personnel for appropriate handling. The third agent had positioned himself to monitor the growing crowd of observers and airport personnel who had gathered around the inspection area. His attention was focused on identifying individuals who might have recorded video or photographs of the interaction, and on assessing whether the public nature of the situation had created security complications that would require additional response measures. Officer Hora found himself in the unprecedented position of being instructed to abandon a security screening by intelligence service personnel whose authority clearly superseded his own. His hands trembled slightly as he began returning items to Lara's duffel bag, his movements reflecting the uncertainty of someone who had lost control of the situation. He had been confident he understood completely. Captain Svoboda approached Agent Director Novak with obvious concern about the implications of intelligence service intervention in what his officers had assessed as routine civilian military impersonation. Sir, we had identified several indicators that suggested this individual was inappropriately wearing military insignia without having earned the right to do so. Are we to understand that our assessment was incorrect? The question reflected the broader confusion that had overtaken the airport security personnel as they struggled to reconcile their confident analysis of Lara's background with the evidence of intelligence service interest in her circumstances. Their training and experience had led them to specific conclusions about her authenticity, and the intervention of national intelligence officers challenged everything they thought they had understood about passenger assessment techniques. Your assessment procedures followed standard protocols, Agent Director Novak replied diplomatically, his response designed to maintain professional relationships while indicating that the security officers had been operating with incomplete information. However, this individual's circumstances involve classified matters that are not apparent through routine screening procedures. Senior Analyst Svoboda had begun collecting the photographs and documentation that the trainee officers had been preparing for their training materials, her actions making it clear that no evidence of this interaction would be available for future reference or educational purposes. The materials that had been intended to demonstrate expertise in identifying civilian military impersonation were being classified as sensitive materials that required official handling procedures. The trainee officers watched with obvious bewilderment as their carefully documented case study was transformed into a classified intelligence matter that they were no longer authorized to observe or discuss. Their notebooks were collected along with their photographs, leaving them with no evidence that the interaction had ever occurred. The crowd of passengers who had been following the security officer's commentary and critique of Lara's appearance found themselves witnessing the complete reversal of the authority dynamic they had been observing. The young woman who had been characterized as a civilian engaging in inappropriate military posturing was now the subject of protective intervention by national intelligence officers, whose presence suggested that her actual circumstances were far more significant than anyone had understood. The formation maintained by the three intelligence officers communicated their professional competence and authority, while creating a protective barrier around Lara that effectively ended the public scrutiny she had been enduring. Their coordinated presence transformed her from a subject of curiosity and criticism into someone whose circumstances clearly involved matters of national security importance. As Officer Hora prepared to return the final items from Lara's wallet, including the concealed compartment he had been about to examine, Agent Director Novak's positioning made it clear that the contents of that compartment would remain undisclosed to airport security personnel, preserving whatever operational secrets had been hidden there throughout the extended screening process. Agent Director Novak stepped forward with deliberate precision, his movement commanding the immediate attention of every person in the customs area. Without speaking, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet case, its official appearance immediately suggesting that it contained something of considerable significance. The case bore the embossed seal of the Czech intelligence service, and its presence created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to suspend all normal airport activity. The other two intelligence officers moved into flanking positions. Their coordinated movement creating a formal presentation formation that transformed the chaotic customs area into something resembling a ceremonial space. Their synchronized positioning demonstrated the kind of practiced precision that characterized official military and intelligence ceremonies, lending weight and gravity to whatever was about to unfold. Senior Analyst Svoboda opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a document bearing official letterhead, her movements deliberate and ceremonial as she prepared to read from what was clearly a formal citation or commendation. The document's appearance, with its official seals and formal formatting, immediately communicated that the proceedings had moved far beyond routine airport security into matters of official recognition and state importance. Operative Nightingale, Agent Director Novak said, using Lara's operational designation rather than her civilian name, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official ceremonies and state occasions. On behalf of the Czech Intelligence Service and our allied partners in the Joint Intelligence Task Force ECHO, we present this commendation for exceptional service in the successful completion of Operation Sanctuary. The use of her operational name in front of the assembled crowd of security officers and passengers immediately confirmed that Lara's true identity was far different from the university student persona she had been maintaining. The formal language and ceremonial tone indicated that whatever recognition was being presented represented achievements of considerable significance and official importance. The velvet case was opened to reveal a medal unlike anything the airport security personnel had ever seen. The decoration bore complex insignia that combined elements from multiple European intelligence organizations, its design suggesting collaborative international operations rather than single-nation military service. The medal's craftsmanship and official presentation indicated recognition at the highest levels of intelligence community hierarchy. Agent Director Novak lifted the medal from its case with the reverence appropriate to military decorations earned through exceptional service and personal sacrifice. His handling of the decoration demonstrated the respect that intelligence professionals accorded to colleagues whose achievements had been earned through operations that carried genuine risks and produced meaningful results for national security. For 18 months of sustained deep cover operations resulting in the disruption of international criminal networks, the rescue of 207 victims of human trafficking, and the prevention of multiple terrorist attacks that would have resulted in significant civilian casualties, Senior Analyst Svoboda read from the official citation, her voice carrying across the customs area with the authority of formal state recognition. The reading of Lara's actual achievements created a profound silence among the observers who had been criticizing her appearance and questioning her authenticity just minutes earlier. The detailed citation provided specific information about operations and accomplishments that far exceeded anything the security officers or passengers had imagined possible for someone they had dismissed as a civilian engaging in military posturing. Metal was pinned to Lara's jacket with ceremonial precision, its placement over the faded surplus store patches creating a stark visual contrast between authentic recognition and the decorative elements that had prompted such extensive criticism. The juxtaposition emphasized how thoroughly the security officers had misunderstood the person they had been examining and the significance of her actual background. Throughout the presentation ceremony, not one word was spoken by any of the three intelligence officers beyond the formal citation and presentation requirements. Their silence carried more weight than extended explanations could have provided, communicating through action and official recognition rather than verbal justification or defense of Lara's credentials and achievements. The airport security personnel, who had been so confident in their assessment of Lara as a civilian military imposter, found themselves witnessing a formal state ceremony, recognizing achievements that exceeded anything in their professional experience. The contrast between their assumptions and the evidence being presented created a cognitive dissonance that was visible in their expressions and body language. Officer Hora stood frozen with Lara's wallet still in his hands, the concealed compartment that he had been about to examine now clearly containing credentials that were far beyond his security clearance to review. His confident assessment of her background had been completely invalidated by evidence that she was not only authentic military personnel, but someone whose service had earned recognition at the highest levels of international intelligence cooperation. Passengers who had been entertained by the security officers' critique of Lara's appearance now found themselves witnessing an official intelligence service ceremony in a public airport facility. Their previous amusement had been replaced by the recognition that they had been observing someone whose actual circumstances involved matters of national security importance. The trainee officers who had been documenting the interaction as an example of civilian military impersonation realized that they had been present for a classified intelligence operation rather than a routine passenger screening. Their training materials had become classified documents that would be confiscated rather than used for educational purposes. The ceremony concluded with Agent Director Novak stepping back and rendering a formal salute that was immediately returned by his two colleagues, creating a moment of official military courtesy that honored Lara's service while maintaining the dignity appropriate to intelligence operations. The silent tribute communicated respect, recognition, and validation that transcended verbal explanation and provided vindication that was both public and complete. As the formal presentation concluded, the customs area remained in stunned silence, with every observer processing the dramatic reversal of their understanding about the young woman, whose authenticity they had so thoroughly questioned and whose character they had so completely misjudged. The moment of recognition that passed between Lara and Agent Director Novak contained layers of meaning that transcended the formal ceremony and spoke to the deeper relationships that existed within the intelligence community. As their eyes met during the medal presentation, both individuals acknowledged not only their professional connection but also the extraordinary circumstances that had brought this recognition to such a public venue under such unexpected conditions. Agent Director Novak had been Lara's primary handler during the 18-month Operation Sanctuary, responsible for coordinating her support network, managing her communications protocols, and ensuring her safety throughout the extended deep cover assignment. His presence at Prague Airport represented more than official recognition. It demonstrated the personal commitment that intelligence supervisors maintain toward operatives who risked their lives in hostile environments while operating with minimal support and maximum isolation. The slight nod that passed between them carried the weight of shared experiences that could never be fully communicated to civilian observers. 18 months of limited contact, emergency protocols, and life-threatening situations had created a professional bond that was based on mutual trust, demonstrated competence, and shared commitment to operations that served larger purposes than personal recognition or advancement. Lara's response to the formal presentation was measured and professional, her bearing demonstrating the discipline that had enabled her to maintain cover identities under extreme pressure while accomplishing mission objectives that required both personal courage and operational skill. Her acceptance of the recognition carried none of the emotional relief that might have been expected from someone who had endured public humiliation. Just minutes earlier, Senior Analyst Svoboda had worked directly with the intelligence data that Lara had provided throughout Operation Sanctuary, transforming raw field observations into actionable intelligence that had enabled law enforcement agencies across 7 countries to coordinate their responses to the trafficking network. Her presence during the recognition ceremony represented the analytical support structure that had made Lara's field operations effective and meaningful. The third intelligence officer, whose role had not been formally identified during the ceremony, was Agent Marcus Novotny, a specialist in operational security who had been responsible for maintaining the protective protocols that had kept Lara's true identity hidden throughout her assignment. His participation in the recognition ceremony indicated that the intelligence service considered her operational security to have been compromised by the airport screening and required immediate protective intervention. The recognition moment also extended to the realization among airport security personnel that they had been conducting their screening under observation by intelligence professionals who had been monitoring the situation from its beginning. The arrival of 3 agents within minutes of the screening's escalation suggested surveillance and protective measures that had been in place throughout Lara's transition from operational status back to civilian cover. Officer Hora's recognition of his error was evident in the way he handled Lara's belongings during their return, his movements reflecting the careful attention that security personnel reserved for items belonging to individuals whose credentials superseded normal protocols. The wallet that he had been examining with such casual authority now represented evidence of identity and authorization that extended far beyond his professional understanding or security clearance. Captain Svoboda's recognition of the situation's significance was demonstrated through his immediate shift from skeptical authority figure to deferential professional who understood that intelligence service intervention indicated matters that fell completely outside airport security jurisdiction. His questions about assessment procedures reflected genuine concern about whether his officers had inadvertently compromised ongoing operations through their screening techniques. The passengers who had been observing the interaction experienced their own recognition moments as they processed the dramatic reversal of everything they had assumed about Lara's background and authenticity. The woman who had criticized Lara for wearing unearned military symbols found herself confronting evidence that those symbols represented achievements that exceeded anything in her family's military experience. The businessman who had compared Lara's patches to wearing sports jerseys without playing professional sports realized that his analogy had been precisely backwards. He had been observing someone whose actual achievements in her field exceeded those of most career professionals, but whose operational requirements had necessitated concealing rather than displaying her credentials. The trainee officers experienced recognition of their own limitations as they understood that their training and passenger assessment had provided them with tools that were inadequate for identifying individuals whose professional backgrounds involved classified operations and specialized credentials. Their educational opportunity had become a lesson in the complexity of intelligence work and the limitations of surface-level analysis. Most significantly, the recognition moment revealed to all observers that authenticity and achievement could not always be determined through appearance, documentation, or behavior patterns that seemed inconsistent with civilian expectations. The contrast between Lara's carefully maintained cover identity and her actual operational background demonstrated that the most significant accomplishments often required remaining invisible rather than seeking recognition. The formal ceremony had provided vindication that was both public and complete, but the recognition moment between intelligence professionals carried deeper meaning about the personal costs and professional satisfactions that characterized careers devoted to protecting national security through operations that would never receive public acknowledgement or appreciation. As Agent Director Novak prepared to conclude the ceremony and escort Lara away from the public attention that had compromised her operational security, the recognition moment served as confirmation that her service had been valued, her sacrifices had been meaningful, and her achievements would be remembered by the people whose opinions mattered most in her chosen profession. The customs area at Prague Airport remained in profound silence for nearly 30 seconds after the formal ceremony concluded, as passengers and security personnel processed the complete reversal of their understanding about the young woman they had so thoroughly misjudged. The medal now prominently displayed on Lara's jacket served as tangible proof that their confident assessments had been entirely wrong, and that authentic service sometimes required concealment rather than display. Agent Director Novak addressed the assembled airport security personnel with the professional courtesy that characterized intelligence service interactions with law enforcement agencies. "Officer Hora, Captain Svoboda, your procedures followed standard protocols, and no security breach occurred," he explained, his tone designed to maintain professional relationships while acknowledging the unusual circumstances. This individual's operational status was classified information that was not available through normal screening procedures. The diplomatic explanation provided the security officers with a face-saving narrative that preserved their professional reputation while acknowledging that they had been operating with incomplete information. Captain Svoboda nodded gratefully, understanding that intelligence service intervention had prevented a situation that could have compromised both airport security protocols and ongoing classified operations. Officer Hora returned Lara's belongings, with movements that reflected newfound respect and careful attention to items he now understood belonged to someone whose credentials far exceeded his security clearance. The wallet that had been the subject of such extensive examination was handed back with the reverence appropriate to documents containing classified materials and operational credentials. The photographs and documentation collected during this screening must remain classified, Senior Analyst Svoboda informed the trainee officers, collecting their materials with efficiency that suggested extensive experience in managing security breaches. "You will sign non-disclosure agreements regarding this interaction before leaving the facility today." The trainee officers nodded with obvious bewilderment, their educational opportunity having become a lesson in operational security and the complexity of intelligence work that extended far beyond their training curriculum. Their case study about civilian military impersonation had been transformed into classified material that would never appear in any training manual or assessment guide. Lara spoke for the first time since the ceremony began, addressing the security officers with the same patient professionalism that had characterized her responses throughout the extended screening. "Thank you for your thoroughness," she said, her voice carrying no trace of resentment, despite the public humiliation she had endured. "Your attention to detail and commitment to security is appreciated, even when circumstances are more complex than they initially appear." The gracious response demonstrated the character that had enabled her to maintain cover identities under extreme pressure, while accomplishing missions that required both personal courage and professional integrity. Her willingness to acknowledge the security officers' dedication to their duties, despite their treatment of her, reflected the operational discipline that had made her successful in hostile environments. The passengers who had been entertained by the security officer's critique of Lara's appearance found themselves witnessing a masterclass in professional grace under pressure. The woman who had criticized her for disrespecting military service approached hesitantly, her expression reflecting genuine remorse for her previous judgment. "I owe you an apology," the older woman said quietly. "My comments were inappropriate, and I should not have assumed I understood your circumstances." Lara accepted the apology with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal, demonstrating that authentic service included representing one's profession with honor even in difficult situations. As the intelligence officers prepared to escort Lara away from the customs area, Agent Director Novak addressed the crowd of observers with a final statement that would ensure the proper conclusion to an extraordinary situation. "What you have witnessed today demonstrates that authentic service often requires sacrifice that goes unrecognized and achievements that must remain hidden. We ask for your discretion regarding the details of this interaction." The request for discretion was both polite and authoritative, carrying the weight of national security considerations, while acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought classified operations into public view. The passengers and airport personnel nodded their understanding, recognizing that they had been present for something far more significant than routine. Airport security procedures. 6 months later, Lara completed her graduate studies with honors and accepted a position as a senior analyst with the European Intelligence Coordination Center. Her academic credentials provided perfect cover for work that would continue to serve international security interests while maintaining the anonymity that made her operationally effective. The faded patches on her military surplus jacket were eventually replaced with properly earned insignia, but she kept the original jacket as a reminder that authentic achievement often required remaining invisible rather than seeking recognition. Sometimes the greatest victories were won not on battlefields, but in customs areas where patience and dignity ultimately triumphed over ignorance and assumption. The security officers at Prague Airport received additional training about operational security and learned to recognize that appearances could be fundamentally misleading when dealing with individuals whose professional requirements included maintaining convincing cover identities. And Officer Hora never again assumed that faded patches told the complete story about the person wearing them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.